Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this wonderful workshop. Today, I will discuss two research projects, both of which deal with smartphone-based interactions. Both projects use a combination of different methods to study the social, communicative, and linguistic phenomena. I really hate this microphone. While the first project focuses on spelling practices of young people in mobile messaging, the second project is concerned with tracing the role of rhythm and temporality in people's everyday digital communication. In this sense, both projects revolve around mostly written communication via smartphones. However, the research questions as well as the research objects in detail are relatively different, so that both projects use rather specific methodological designs. So today I will not only outline these two projects, explain the respective methodological designs, and finally give you an insight into the findings of each project. I will also relate the two methodological settings to each other. This is because similar theoretical considerations about what it takes to comprehensively describe language use underlie both projects. More specifically, both project designs share a meta-methodological recourse to Michael Silverstein's concept of the total linguistic fact. Okay, so much for the rough plan of my presentation. I will first tell you about the meta-methodological background based on the idea of the total linguistic fact. This will be followed by a presentation of the first and already completed project on spelling cues in young people's digital everyday life. I then turn to the new project, Texting in Time, that deals with temporalities in everyday smartphone usage. For both projects, I will first present the methodic design and then provide you with exemplary analysis. The overview of the methodological steps will be painfully detailed at times, but I hope that is in the spirit of the workshop theme. For both projects, I will also try to draw a conclusion on how the practices under study can be understood through the lens of a multi-methodological perspective. First then, let's go to the concept that made it into the title of this talk. In an article dealing with the relation of the grammatical coding of gender in modern English and its relation to socio-pragmatic issues of gender identity, Michael Silverstein writes about the interconnectedness of three phenomena in linguistic research. The total linguistic fact, the datum for a science of language, is irreducibly dialectic in nature. It is an unstable mutual interaction of meaningful sign forms, contextualized to situations of interest to human use, and mediated by the fact of cultural ideology. This linking of three phenomenal areas is not only a bold statement that identifies central dimensions of language as a cultural practice, it is also, in my view, a methodological guideline that helps us to develop our own research designs and provides an opportunity to check existing research for possible blind spots. Typically, linguistic work does not take all three dimensions into account. So, disciplinary boundaries in what Silverstein calls the science of language can be revealed in terms of which of the three dimensions is the primary focus of a study. It may be the interest in grammatical structures as pursued in the study of morphology and syntax. It may be the interest in communicative action as pursued in pragmatics or even in conversation analysis. Or it may be a question of language and communication ideologies, as it is the focus in many studies of linguistic anthropology. Of course, most modern work in linguistics is hardly so limited that it actually touches only one of the three areas. Usually, we can relate studies to two dimensions of the TLF. For example, if we look at work in interactional linguistics, we find on the one hand a focus on grammatical structures, on the other hand, the explanatory linkage of these structures back to situated communicative actions. However, the ideologies that people share in order to render linguistic action as meaningful are categorically left out in these studies of interactional linguistics. And even studies that share the conviction on a theoretical level that all three dimensions are relevant for the analysis of linguistic phenomena usually still develop a focus by empirically investigating one or perhaps two dimensions, while a third dimension is at best anecdotically or introspectively included into the discussion. And please don't get me wrong here. I'm not saying that these studies are not valuable. You can't study everything at the same time to the same degree. We are all trained differently, coming from different disciplinary fields, and we have different interests. And most importantly, we have a limited capacity to do research. So focusing on phenomena is essential, but still we should be aware of incorporating other perspectives. And this was kind of the idea when we worked out the research designs of the two projects I'm going to present to you right now. So the first project came about because of my interest in the everyday writing of young people. Here you can see an overview of the various literacy events in the everyday life of German teenagers in the tension between formality, informality, and publicity, privateness. It is certainly not complete, but gives you maybe a feeling for the proliferation of everyday literacy events. Even though everyday literacy 14 years ago was already a mosaic of various literacy practices, we can observe a qualitative and quantitative rise in informal writing in the course of digitalization. For the everyday literacy of young people, this means in particular we can identify two main cores of literacy practice. Aside from formal school writing, it is mainly an informal and interpersonal writing with close friends via digital smartphone-based applications. I was interested in how this proliferation of socio-situational context of writing comes along with the proliferation of various spelling styles. And I was interested in how young people rationalize and organize their various graphic and linguistic resources metapragmatically in order to master the heterogeneous daily literacy events socially. So in short, the project deals with written variation in adolescents' daily digital communication. In the project, the spectrum of features of written linguistic structures I investigated was as broad as possible. I looked on spelling variation as well as on emoji and emoticon usage. And I also investigated a third, relatively fixed feature set that is an essential part of our alphabetic keyboards and in this respect of our daily mediatized communicative lives: punctuation marks. But before I tell you more about punctuation and the role of punctuation in everyday digital interactions of German adolescents as an exemplary insight into the findings of the project, let me give you a few central points about the methodic framework behind it. A core theoretical concept to capture the different spelling practices of the adolescent participants was that of register. Register is understood in very different ways in the linguistic literature, but usually means a relatively stable link between certain linguistic forms and certain communicative contexts. In order to come close to developing a methodological design that takes three sides of the total linguistic fact into account, three different register theories were related to each other in the project. Each of these theories goes back to different disciplines and also requires different methodological approaches. The first was the register concept of systemic functional linguistics according to Halliday. This aims at the communicative situation and the actions performed in it, which then functionally require certain linguistic forms. Secondly, I refer to Biber's corpus linguistic register studies, which contrastively investigate how certain linguistic structures are distributed in different contexts. And last, I integrated the register concept of linguistic anthropology, which places an emphasis on the language ideological processes of enregisterment in order to understand how and why social actors associate certain linguistic forms with certain contextual meanings. If we compare these three approaches, we see that not only basic theoretical assumptions about language-context relationships differ. From these different assumptions follows the focusing on different research objects. While the SFL examines communicative activities in different situations, the computational register studies are primarily interested in linguistic structures in different predefined contexts. And finally, linguistic anthropology is particularly interested in the metapragmatic ideologies with which a population calibrates linguistic variation and social values. This triangulation on a theoretical level now also results in an overlay of different methods for the project, that is, frequency analysis to learn more about the distribution of certain features, qualitative sequence analysis to analyze specific spelling practice in action, so to speak, and ethnographic-oriented analysis to also include the language ideological beliefs of the participants themselves. So, to become a little more practical, how can such a TLF-oriented approach be applied for the exploration of digital punctuation? Well, if we take the triad of structure, use, and ideology as a starting point, this leads us to 3 research questions. First, how are punctuation marks distributed among the participants' text samples? Second, how are punctuation marks functionalized into a communicative resource? And third, how do the participants reflect on punctuation marks metapragmatically? So what we will look at in the following is the use of digital punctuation by German adolescents in frequencies, interactional practices, and metapragmatic awareness. Helpful for our interest in digital punctuation are the 2 different data types I collected in 4 high schools in and around Hamburg in 2016. First, there are 23 text portfolios with formal and informal writing samples by individual writers between the age of 12 and 18. Each portfolio includes at least 2 formal school texts and 2 private WhatsApp chat logs. In total, this results in a school sample with a total token count of about 23,000 and a larger WhatsApp sample of about 152,000 tokens. In addition, I draw on 7 semi-structured group interviews with a total of 16 participants. All these interviewees come from the group of portfolio writers. The adolescents discussed their metapragmatic awareness of written variation in general and practices such as non-standard punctuation in particular. I draw on these group discussions to contextualize the frequential and interactional analysis of the textual data. Okay, so let us start by comparing the overall frequencies of punctuation in the text portfolio sample. The automatic counting of punctuation in the school sample was relatively simple after all text had been digitized. More challenging was the counting of punctuation in the 47 WhatsApp chat logs. In cooperation with the coder, we developed a Python script that counts the relevant frequencies per participant and excludes all system messages from the chat log files. You can see an example of a result output here. These are the results for a chat of the 17-year-old participant Frank with his friend Martin. In the first 2 paragraphs, we find information about the counts of token, messages, emoji, punctuation marks, and so on. In the 3rd and 4th paragraphs, we find information about the frequencies of the most common words, emojis, emoticons, and punctuation marks per writer. In addition, all chat logs were coded manually in MaxQDA. With regard to punctuation, this additional coding mainly concerned topological annotations. So, for example, it seemed interesting to us whether a punctuation mark was placed at the beginning, middle, or end of a message. Based on this counting, a first overview of the distribution of punctuation marks between the 2 samples is possible. The black numbers show the frequency of a punctuation mark per 1,000 words. The figure suggests that the distribution of certain punctuation signs varies by text type. In general, there's more punctuation in the school sample than in the WhatsApp sample. Especially syntactic punctuation plays a bigger role in school writing than in digital texting. In contrast, the question mark, as well as the apostrophe and the ellipsis dots, can be observed more frequently in the WhatsApp sample. By drawing on quantitative register studies, these frequency differences can be interpreted functionally. So, for example, in terms of frequency, the question mark clearly is a feature of the informal digital register. In functional terms, this makes sense due to the dialogic setting of WhatsApp interactions when compared to non-dialogic school essays. The opposite is true for syntactic punctuation. For example, the period is predominant as most frequent punctuation sign in the formal text types of school, while there are only 3.7 periods per 1,000 words in informal digital writing by the same informants. Periods seem to be marginalized in digital texting. But is that all we can say? It is worth taking a closer look here. Focusing on the distribution of these few periods in the WhatsApp data, the first finding is that only 12 out of 23 participants use periods at all. In addition, the frequencies of period usage are also low for all of these participants, with the exception of 17-year-old Frank. For example, Lisa's chat, it's here in line 11, with more than 2,600 messages, only contain 7 periods. This finding suggests the emergence of a new norm in informal digital texting, the omission of periods. A second finding concerns the period's position in the messages. Most periods occur in a message internal position, while only 4 out of 23 participants set periods at the end of messages at all, with a distinctly lower frequency as well. The fact that the usage of periods appears to be quantitatively marginalized on the one hand, and on the other hand occurs for the most part in message internal positions, directs the analytical focus to the 89 message final periods we find in the data. It is to be asked whether an interactional analysis can explain these periods. To answer this question, we focus on Frank, who is by far the most extensive period user in the data. In his 841 messages, we find 487 periods. Most of these periods are in a message internal position though. While these examples all include message internal periods, they either lack any message final punctuation sign at all or make use of other terminating signs such as question marks, emoticons, or ellipses. In this way, Frank terminates 91% of all his messages. But still, the remaining 9% of Frank's messages have a period and final position. So what's the deal with these 74 messages? Here, an interactional analysis can show that these message final periods are deployed as socio-indexical signs pointing to certain interpersonal stances. What we see is that two different interactional strategies of the use of message final periods are in the data. The first and more frequent strategy of stance taking can be analyzed in terms of register switching. Here, the terminating period is part of a cluster of lexical, morphological, and graphemic features by which a formal standard register is materialized graphically. Consider the following example, which comes from a WhatsApp group chat of computer gamers that Frank is a member of. After a racist joke by the group member Arnil, Frank joins the discussion on racism with his statement in message 4. Compared to his previous messages, Frank switches here to a much more standard register materialized by lexical and morphological choices, as well as the message final period. The stylistic deployment of these forms indicates not only a formal stance, but is also linguistic ideologically tied to stances of authority. This is why such a register switching can be observed more frequently in moments of interactive competition. In order to claim authority for his definition of what racism is, Frank sets a message final period. Frank's second pattern of stance taking through message final periods concerns unwilling responsive turns. More specifically, Frank tends to use periods to contextualize his unwillingness of further negotiation within an interactional sequence. He even rounds off short answers like okay with a period, which is quite unusual in the data. In these cases, the period not only indicates that Frank sees no further room for negotiation, but also goes hand in hand with dispreferred utterances and therefore becomes unregistered as an index of interpersonal disalignment. A striking example is this short sequence between Frank and Martin. Frank's use of periods in his responsive turn in message 2. This provokes a metapragmatic evaluation on the part of Martin by asking if Frank is annoyed or something in message 3. Furthermore, Martin explicates his assessment as dependent on Frank's punctuation by stylizing in exaggregated, indeed ungrammatical segmentations with periods in message 4. When Frank rejects this interpretation in message 5, Martin directly refers to his period use in message 6. Even though Frank again rejects Martin's interpretation by focusing on the syntactic function of the period, it becomes evident that the two of them must share some metapragmatic knowledge about the interactional function of the period as an index of bad mood. This is remarkable since Frank sets relatively many periods compared to other participants. Yet his use of periods attracts metapragmatic comment. What you see is that we have already moved on to the third question of the TLF-oriented research framework. How do the participants reflect on punctuation marks metapragmatically? Such explicit metapragmatic evaluation is rarely spelled out in the messenger data, but was often thematized in the group interviews, where I used authentic examples from the data to prompt discussion about punctuation signs. See, for example, the following excerpt from an interview with the two 17-year-old female high school students, Jana and Leonie. I asked them, why aren't they putting any periods in the end at the end of their sentences? Nope, one simply doesn't do that. One doesn't do that, really. I never do that as well. No, it's so annoying. I text with someone who does periods at the end of messages, and I already told him that this really annoys me. It isn't cool at all. Why is it so annoying? I don't know. It looks totally weird somehow. One doesn't write proper sentences all the time, for example. It would be totally weird if there was a period after haha. And actually, it is already, I think it looks so bracketed already because of the speech bubbles of WhatsApp. So you don't need to add an extra period there. It looks so weird too. The reflections begin with a strong assertion of an informal register norm by Jana. One simply does not do that. Line 2. Subsequently, the two interviewees give a couple of arguments against the use of periods in informal digital texting. While Jana and Leonie reflect on explanations against the use of periods in texting, the 13-year-old female high school student Jessica makes up a prototypical situation in which she uses the period intentionally. She said, a classic situation. You are texting with a guy and you are annoyed. Then you bring up some periods. You generally do that. Yeah, punctuation in general, just to make the message kind of tougher, I guess you could say. Because you usually use that more in regular text or something, when you're texting with adults or something. So it's more like cold and factual. The imagined situation, you're texting with a guy and you're annoyed, sets the reference point for Jessica's explanation of the period as an index for bad mood, something we already saw in Frank and Martin's example. The period is metaphorically conceptualized as being hard, cold, and factual. It is unregistered with the category of normal text, by which Jessica probably refers to activities and products of formal school writing, and the addressee groups of adults. Therefore, the period itself becomes an indexical resource by which a given interactional situation can be socially contextualized. In these situations, the formal period is recontextualized in informal texting in order to index formal writing activities and establish an emotionally distancing positioning that is part of these activities. Though this indexicality to the standard register should not be misunderstood as register switching. The period can only do this distancing contextualization in informal digital texting, in a register in which the period appears marked as an alien sign, we could say. So when we go back to our triangle of research questions and methods, then we could now outline some tendencies of digital punctuation oriented to the total linguistic fact. The frequency analysis sheds some light on the structures of punctuation in different text types. We have seen that punctuation is functionally distributed, that syntactic punctuation is rather marginalized in interpersonal digital texting. At the same time, we've noticed the high frequencies of communicative signs, especially the question mark. The sequence analysis also showed that recurring interactional strategies of punctuation use can be observed. Even a traditional syntactic sign, like the period, is refunctionalized and used to indicate interpersonal stances. And finally, the more ethnographic complement to the analysis showed that the participants display a high metapragmatic awareness, even of small and rarely used punctuation marks, such as the period. This reflexive awareness lays the foundation of the social indexicality of digital punctuation. Okay, I now move on to the second project. In this project too, we are concerned with contextualization processes of social actors in their everyday smartphone interactions. Unlike the spelling project, however, the focus is not on graphic sign forms, but on the question of what role rhythm and time play in everyday digital interactions. So before I go into detail, let's address the underlying question. What is time in interaction, and why is it interesting to analyze it? Temporality is a central object for the study of linguistic communication because language use extends linearly in time. If we are interested in face-to-face interactional language, we trace how contributions are successively produced in time by speakers and successively received by hearers at the same time, that is, synchronously. And even more. Communicative actions such as turn-taking, repairs, but also the execution of larger communicative projects, for example, such as telling a story, are jointly coordinated in time by co-participants. It is the moment-of-moment synchronization that Mushin and Pikarek-Döhler locate at the very heart of interaction. And therefore, all linguistic resources can be approached as being adapted to or structured by their temporality. If we now return to our interest in digitally mediated interaction, we can see that here too, temporality quickly became central to the reasoning in linguistics. However, the perspective in the early days of linguistics that was engaged with the study of computer-mediated communication was more of a technological one that focused on the temporal affordances and limitations of media, less on the temporal practices of actual participants. So, to put it simply, the chat program was in the center of considerations, not the chat user. However, this technological view of temporality in digital communication has become very differentiated in recent years, as you can see here, for example, in Michael Beiswenger's model of text-based interaction. It is in German, but I'll try to take you through it. Beiswenger depicts the communication process of a posting, such a text or a voice message, on the basis of 5 points in time. On the producing side, the intention to produce a posting is made at T1, which marks the beginning of the production time, that ends at T2 when the posting is fully formulated and written down. At T3, the posting is fed into the screen protocol by pressing send. So the message is sent and made available on the screens of all participants with a timestamp. This enables a perception time, T4, at which the posting is perceived by another participant and the reception time begins. This is completed at T5, when the so-called time of obligation has occurred. That is, when the posting that has been processed in such a way that expectations of action on the part of the recipient are derived from its content. For example, the expectation to go into posting production yourself and to feed a responsive message into the protocol. This basic temporal sequence cannot be avoided due to the media infrastructure. At the same time, however, I think we have to consider where there is room for temporal agency, where media users are not at the mercy of the machine, but where participants are able to set discourse-relevant points in time strategically. For example, when a received WhatsApp message is not opened in order, for example, to escape the blue check marks that mark the occurrence of T4 visible for all co-participants. Or even what period of time you allow to pass between T5 and a possibly T6 as a new T1 of a responding posting. Or the period of time that elapses between T3 of your own posting before another posting is initiated, written down, and then made available again. Yeah, as a double posting, so to speak. I argue that it is precisely this temporal agency that is a powerful resource for meaning making. As the rhythms of posting messages vary, these temporal entities can be interpreted indexically as communicatively meaningful. Rhythm then becomes a contextualization resource of digital interaction in the sense of Gumpert's. Rodney Jones, for example, also has pointed out how participants in chat rooms signal communicative interest and involvement to each other through interactional rhythms. Nonetheless, temporal norms differ across communities of practice, sometimes considerably. While in the gay dating chats Jones studied, a response is sometimes expected within only a few seconds, in other contexts, significantly longer response times of hours, days, or even weeks are sometimes considered normal. Temporal norms are tied to communities, addressee types, and activity types. So when we look at the social and communicative meanings of rhythm and time in digital communication, we always must consider the cultural ideologies, the language ideologies, as well as the media ideologies that people share about temporality. The question that is negotiated in the meta discourse is always, what is a good time? What is a proper time in digital communication? In the words of Elizabeth Freeman, we are dealing with chrononormativity here. And so, from a theoretical perspective, instead of a meta-deterministic view of temporal constraints, an analytical focus on socio-technical chrononormative frameworks can take its place. A methodical approach can then be to track which socio-technical chrononormative frameworks run through the everyday life of people and how different chrononormativities possibly overlap in the everyday life of a person. because typically in a digitized late modern society, a person participates in very different communities of practice, each sharing different ideologies about good communication. Over the course of a day, for example, a person then maybe interacts with a close friend via iMessage in a specific, relatively close-knit rhythm. However, of course, the person may also be in touch with other contacts via digital, probably mobile media. A second iMessage interaction may then unfold in parallel, but at a slightly different pace. And finally, alongside the more private interaction, perhaps work emails or maybe responding to some direct messages on Twitter would merge into the overlay of digital rhythms. This is what Caroline and Agnieszka just described with their day in a life approach. Individuals focus on their mobile devices from time to time as part of their everyday routines. These moments of device attention then produce a certain rhythm in their interactions. Caroline and Agnieszka say multiplayer digital conversations can be shaped not only by social demands and conventions, but by the wider rhythms of an individual's day as individuals check their phones in instances of device attention. Now, this temporality of mediatized social lives can be methodically investigated on different scales. On the one hand, on a larger scale, we can look at the rhythm that individuals establish with contacts over days, weeks, months, or even years. On the other hand, we can also zoom in on small temporal scales and understand how multiple simultaneous interactions are coordinated by co-participants from moment to moment. These temporal patterns of smartphone communication on large scales as well as on small scales are what we want to explore in the new research project Texting in Time. The project is SNSF funded and allows us to investigate temporalities in smartphone communication over the next 4 years with a great team consisting of 2 PhD students, 5 students assistants, and additional support by the digital humanities. So on the one hand, we track the temporal patterns of smartphone communication in the lives of our participants over a broader period of time. That is a period of 14 days for each participant. Over these 14-day periods, we hope to identify individual rhythms for each participant, patterns of device attention, and possibly uncover layerings of temporal norms with respect to different addressees and communities of practice. A large-scale perspective can thus allow a description of the overlapping of different rhythms in everyday life, and thus also a socio-linguistic view of the temporal overlapping of diverse linguistic resources in the mediatized everyday life of our participants. Because what we also observed during the 14 days is how the participants manifest their linguistic repertoire in the rhythms of their smartphone communication, and that specific languages, dialects, registers, and styles are bound to addressees, which in turn have their specific temporal order. On the other hand, we will look in closer detail at moment-to-moment interactional coordination and analyze temporal practices in interaction, including the organization of simultaneous participation in different interactions as multi-activity. For example, we are interested in what resources and practices of temporal contextualization participants use to unfold their interactions from moment to moment. For example, when they speed up the rhythm by splitting messages, when they wait in the chat window due to the typing status of their interlocutor, or when they don't wait and close the chat, and so on and so forth. Relevant for us here is also the fast switching between different chat contexts, but also between different apps. For example, when a participant switches from WhatsApp to Instagram and in a certain way performs multi-activity during the period of device attention. And finally, we are also interested in how text message construction is temporally structured. When, for example, do participants revise their message before sending it? And when do they delete a written message, perhaps even completely? In addition, at the end of the project, we will openly publish an online database that will give access to our data as well as to our visualizations. The database is also designed to be open so that it will be possible to add further data even from completely different cultural contexts. But what is our data actually? We collect screen capture videos that show us the smartphone screens of participants over a period of 2 weeks each. This gives us in-depth insight into the communicative processes and not only to the static products, which could also be read from static chat logs. We include a diverse field of participants, including not only German and Swiss participants, but also representing different lifestyles and age groups. Another feature is that our research is not only focusing on one software application or one platform, but is considering a broad spectrum of different platforms. So in the data we already gathered, we already find the usage of apps such as WhatsApp, Instagram, TikTok, iMessage, Signal, Hinge, Facebook, Snapchat, YouTube, and multiple email clients. We then anonymize and transcribe the recordings and finally contextualize them, again, with interviews in which we ask for additional information about language biographies, media biographies, and metapragmatic awareness of temporal practices. So the interviews as an additional data source are important to gather more information about our participants and about their ideological beliefs in order to make sense of their screen recordings and to open up the bigger picture, so to speak. Screen capture data then provides a view through the eyes of participants that comes with some methodological advantages. For our interest in temporal practices, the data type seems very useful because unlike static chat logs, it gives us access to awareness cues that participants use to organize their interactions from moment to moment. These are, for example, reading confirmations, but also status displays about online or typing activity. In addition, we can track how participants scroll through their chat histories, how they wait or even switch back and forth between different interactions. Furthermore, we have access to the message construction process. We can see how participants formulate messages and how they revise them, sometimes even delete them completely. And all this is shown to us in the real-time experience of a participant. So we don't have to rely on the timestamps and chat logs, but can track temporal patterns in high resolution. As you can imagine, these benefits do not come for free. On the one hand, the data collection is anything but trivial in terms of ethical considerations. And on the other hand, the technical preparation process that this type of data entails is very time-consuming. So let me elaborate on both points. In terms of the ethical considerations, first of all, the fundamental principle is that we only collect data when participants have given informed consent. This is not a big problem regarding our participants who record their screens. We know them well and there's enough exchange and preparation to get informed consent. However, secondary participants, those who communicate with our primary participants and therefore end up in our data, become more problematic. We also inform these secondary participants and ask for consent in advance. It has proven practical to find out who the core contacts of our primary participants are as early as at least 3 weeks before the data collection. Typically, these are close friends, family members, and colleagues. If we know about them in advance, consent forms can be obtained. More difficult are individuals who unexpectedly come into contact with our primary participants during the 14 days collection period. For these peripheral contacts, our primary participants are instructed to inform them about the data collection, forward them to us, and, if allowed, give us the opportunity to collect consent forms via an online form. In addition to this basic principle of consent, it also seems important to us to compensate at least the primary participants financially. They receive 200 francs, what is roughly like 200 euros, for their participation. Moreover, this financial compensation is certainly the most important aspect to find participants at all who want to share such sensitive data with us. Furthermore, we guarantee that they can revoke their consent as well as that we strictly anonymize all data. Technically, this is done by means of video editing. All sensitive data is blurred and all names are replaced with pseudonyms. Data for which there is no consent but which was nevertheless recorded is completely masked. For example, a pop-up notification of a message for which there is no consent. Finally, it is important that the participants themselves decide what to record and what to leave out. Of course, it would be desirable to have 100% coverage. However, this would not be so ethically right. So the participants turn the recording on and off on their own, and we do not install any spy software. And basically, this also gives participants the right not to record certain interactions at all. Our hope is that these holes in the data can be excused, as our goal is to identify the bigger picture of temporal structures in everyday digital life. So now, if we take a quick look at the path of our data, we walk through the following stages. It starts with acquiring participants. This happens through advertising, for example with a flyer, but also by systematic contacting by the systematic contacting of people in different social contexts. For example, we plan to contact rural sports clubs or specifically recruit elderly people as participants in order to obtain a sample that is as diverse as possible. In the second step, the interested participants will then be informed about our project. They have the opportunity to ask questions, and we already clarified the technical procedure. In addition, the collection of consent forms from all participants begins. Finally, this marks the beginning of the data collection period, during which we are in constant contact with the participants to make sure that everything is working. After the 2 weeks, the data is then handed over to us on an USB stick so that the non-anonymized data does not have to be stored online. We then have time to go over the data already once and possibly note any striking phenomena so that we can talk in the following interviews not only about the participants' basic metapragmatic thoughts, but also about specific events that are documented in the screen recordings. After the interview, the participants then receive their financial compensation. And that's where the real work begins. The raw data is first registered and made clearly identifiable. For all data, the consent forms are checked again, and all participants are given a pseudonym. On this basis, the anonymization of the video data then begins with the help of the Adobe Premiere Pro program. The workflow is relatively complex and would not be possible without the help of our 5 student assistants. Finally, we will also transcribe the data by using the software ELAN. We are currently in the process of developing an appropriate transcription system based on suggestions already made in the field of digital conversation analysis. It will be important not only to represent the messages sent as textual products in the transcript, but also to make the process of smartphone use over time visible and analyzable. And finally, these data will then be transferred into a database in which visualizations of the data sample will be produced on the basis of our transcripts. Okay, that was the painfully detailed explanation I was talking about at the beginning. Now, in the remaining time, I would like to show you some first explorative examples from the data to outline how both perspectives, a large-scale perspective and a small-scale perspective, can help exploring the data. Let us first take a large-scale perspective. Here you can see a visualization of one day from Kara's screen recordings. Kara is a 26-year-old music student from Germany living in Switzerland. The graph shows Kara's smartphone interactions on one day on a 24-hour timeline. Red dots represent the time when Kara reads an incoming message. Green dots represent the time when Kara sends an own message. The gray bars preceding red dots indicate how long a message has been waiting unread on Kara's device. By now moving along the dashed line, we follow how Kara enters into different communicative constellations throughout the day and unfolds interactions partly simultaneously. She starts the day at 9:38, first reading a message in a group chat, then switching to an Instagram message. Not answering it, by the way. As the dashed line gets steeper, the interactional events move closer together in time. Between 10 and 11 a.m., for example, Kara is engaged in simultaneous interactions with Caro, Liz, and her father. Thus we see multi-activity here, the rapid switching between chats that is typical of Kara's smartphone use. And we also see a pattern here that emerges for other days as well. There are typically 3 clusters of Kara's daily routine in which a particularly high level of activity takes place. In the morning at the breakfast table, then often around lunchtime, and finally in the evening when Kara first reads new received messages on the train on her way home and then answers it at home. That is what Carolyn and Agnieszka just called device attention. Looking at Kara's data, the critique of the idea of always on as too rough can therefore be agreed with. Kara does not use her smartphone anytime and anywhere. Instead, the medium enables her to have temporal clustered exchanges with a great number of contacts. Using Kara as an example, we can observe how people take their time and how they devote their time to digital contacts and then enter into parallel interactions during this time. The components of these interactional clusters each have different rhythms. While the interaction with Liz, for example, takes place over a period from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. with several hours between messages, the interaction with Caro is characterized by a rapid change of messages. Elizabeth Brummer refers to this temporal structuring as polychronicity during simultaneity. Different activities not only happen simultaneously, but have different temporalities and temporal demands, which all occur at the same time and at the same situation. This is also reflected by Kara herself, who contrasts two of her contexts in the interview. Well, I think Marco, for example, isn't usually as quick. But it also depends. I have the feeling that he's a bit selective about it. So if something interests him, he naturally replies faster. But if it's something random or something that doesn't really interest him, it takes longer. And Anna, for example, she's very diligent and a very diligent and conscientious person. She usually replies immediately. In Kara's answer, we can see chrononormativity, an ideological rationalization of temporality in which fast replying is indexically linked to positive character traits, namely Anna's sense of duty. Moreover, Kara opens a perspective on the variability of interactional rhythm as an indicator of communicative attitude. If Marco answers quickly, he's interested in the topic, while a late answer suggests disinterest. Against the background of an established interactional rhythm, accelerations or decelerations can be interpreted as contextualization cues. These are phenomena of temporality which we want to explore with a view to weeks and days. To come to an end, however, I would like to show you a piece of data that sheds light on the complexity of texting practices within only a few minutes. The data piece comes from the participant Natasha, who is 28 years old and also lives in Switzerland. While we looked at an entire day with Kara, this excerpt focuses on only 4 minutes in which Natasha sends text messages to 5 different addressees via WhatsApp and is also active on Uber and on Snapchat. In total, Natasha composes 18 messages throughout the 4 minutes. The episode takes place after a get-together with friends. Natasha is on the train on her way home and now has time for device attention. On the one hand, she uses this time to work through messages that have been arriving on her device for hours. On the other hand, she keeps in touch with her friend Karina, with whom she had just spent the evening together. The data piece begins with Natasha recording a nearly 1.5-minute voice message for Fabia, telling about the evening. The status display shows that Fabia is on her device as well and at least opens the message, but she won't give a response within the 4 minutes though. Natasha switches to Karina and posts, "Text me when you are in the Uber. Text me when you are in the Uber." It becomes clear that Natasha has ordered an Uber for Karina, as Natasha now opens the Uber app and follows the car's route. After scrolling back and forth on the city map, Natasha opens WhatsApp again. First, she opens the chat with Sebastian and thanks him for a conversation. It is not clear from the data whether Sebastian may also have been present at the party. However, the message appears to be because it does not refer to any of Sebastian's previous contributions. Back on the home screen of WhatsApp, it shows that there are previously unread messages in 2 chats. First, Natasha opens the newer message from Carola. The two had arranged to meet on Friday, and Carola had asked if they wanted to have a barbecue then. Natasha replies with a text message that she doesn't have time on Friday after all, and if they could possibly reschedule the appointment. After that, Natasha goes to the chat with Amélie. There are 9 unread messages here, some of which are clear as responsive due to WhatsApp's reply function. Obviously, Amélie and Natasha work on different thematic strands, which are then all continued in moments of device attention with the help of the reply function. Natasha takes her time and writes a total of 6 responsive text messages to Amélie within 79 seconds. After this cascade of messages, Natasha calls up the home screen of WhatsApp again. And now something interesting happens. Natasha notices that Karina, for whom she had called the Uber, is typing a message. This is the black dot in the graph. This attention cue now seems to be drawing Natasha towards reopening Karina's chat. Natasha's instruction, "Text me when you are in the Uber," has already been fulfilled by means of the status display, even before Karina's message has been sent. Natasha already infers from the status that Karina must be in the Uber and accordingly and jokingly asks if the driver is nice. Here we see how the typing status apparently conditions participation. This play with temporality also uses the fact that Natasha already knows the name of the Uber driver because she just called him. After that, Natasha accessed Snapchat for a short time, but is then informed via a pop-up notification that Karina has finally replied. Natasha immediately reopens WhatsApp, reads the message that appreciates her temporal joke, and now gives the next instruction. Get home safe and text me when you get there. I think we can discover some central aspects in this short segment. Once again, we see the importance of device attention, a period of time in which various interactional strands are continued, and how this device attention is related to an online-offline nexus insofar as Natasha is making the most of her time on the train. We also see that, on the one hand, reference is made to immediate spatio-temporally present interactions. In that a just-ended party is communicatively followed up and concluded via mobile texting. We also can see how sometimes complex interactions with several thematic strands are processed en bloc in moments of device attention. And finally, we can see from the example how the participants actively deal with the display of awareness cues, such as the typing status, and use them as communicative resource to organize their interactions. Okay, let me wrap things up. What I presented in the second half of my talk was basically the starting point of our new research project, Texting in Time, in which we want to investigate the temporalities of smartphone-based interaction. I showed how digital mediated interactions are temporal entities and how temporality and rhythm are not only dictated by the medium, but are open to temporal agency. Temporality and rhythm are always means of contextualization. In order to be able to explore these phenomena, the data type of screen capture seems to me to be particularly helpful because it enables us to see through the eyes of the participants. I have tried to illustrate how this can look with two examples. On the one hand, we can take a large-scale perspective and reconstruct the temporal patterns in which digitally mediated language runs through people's daily lives. On the other hand, we can zoom into the shortest time spans and trace how participants organize their interactions from moment to moment under the conditions of constant potential multi-activity. For both perspectives, the reconstruction of online-offline nexus becomes a necessary and sometimes challenging task, as digital rhythms on large scales as well as on small scales are always merged with the spatial context and bodily action of participants. Clusters of device attention are not only rhythmically structured, but also bound to physical places, such, for example, Kara's breakfast table in her kitchen. Like the spelling project, the Texting in Time project benefits from developing a TLF-oriented methodological framework, including not only quantification of writing pauses and writing activity, but also qualitative interaction analysis to capture the moment-to-moment process of smartphone communication. However, it seems to me that the integration of additional background knowledge through interviews, as well as the possibility to collect central ideologies of the participants about language, media, and temporality, and to include them in the analysis of the other datasets is particularly important for the project. The next 4 years will show us how well this in the end succeeds. So, thank you very much for your attention.